Well, good evening, everybody. If you have a Bible, and I hope you do, you can find yourself in Ruth chapter 3. Ruth 3 is where we'll be this evening. We use the word faith a lot in the Christian church, and I think for good reason. Faith is an important word. Faith is a word that matters a lot to about everything we believe. Faith is integral to belief. Faith is a part of our theology. We all love to sing about faith, think about faith, have faith, talk about faith. But I think faith, a lot like love and like grace and other words in that kind of realm, often get used so much that we forget what they even mean, or we forget that they're words with definitions. And sometimes even if we know their definitions, the definitions don't actually help us out that much in understanding them. I think a lot of times when people use the word faith, what they mean is just some version of what we would call Christian pixie dust that they just sprinkle over a bad situation. Like, well, just have faith. And what they mean is have a general sense of optimism about this thing, or just don't be too distractingly upset about it. It turns into a word that just means some version of spiritual positive thinking. And that's not really the definition of faith that the Bible gives us. Now, if you're a particularly sharp thinker, you might know that the Bible does give us a definition of faith in somewhere like Hebrews 11 that says faith is the substance of things hoped for. But even in Hebrews 11, it doesn't really just leave us with a definition. It very quickly goes on to give us example after example after example of what faith looks like. You know, in Hebrews 11, we get Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Rahab. In James 2, when James attempts a definition at faith and tells us that faith without works is dead, what does he immediately do? Well, he immediately lists examples of what that faith looks like Abraham and again Rahab. Because faith is a word that I think is, it transcends definition. It's not something you can merely define. It's too alive and too rich and too textured to just be words on a page. You need to see faith to understand it. You need stories of faith. And that's exactly what Ruth 3 is. I think almost as clear as anywhere in the Bible, Ruth 3 is a picture of true Christian faith. And tonight what I want to do is hold Ruth 3 up kind of like a diamond and just move it around and show you different facets of faith that are seen in Ruth 3. So that instead of getting just a definition of faith, you can see faith lived out in the life of Ruth. But if we have one big idea for tonight that I'm going to explore in 5 ways, it's this: that biblical faith is not confidence in faith itself. Biblical faith is the intentional, vulnerable entrusting of yourself to a worthy Redeemer. And so we're going to look at 5 aspects of that faith in Ruth chapter 3, and we won't read the whole story at once. We'll take it as we go, and the first thing we're going to look at is that faith is intentional. We're going to look at this in Ruth 3, 1-5. So if you will look with me. It says, "Then Naomi, her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." If you haven't been here with us, just to give you some background on where we've been in Ruth, Ruth 1 was all bad news. It was a series of unfortunate events. It was death and destruction and heartache. Naomi lost her husband. Naomi lost her children. In that, though, Naomi gained a daughter-in-law in Ruth, and Ruth bound herself to Naomi. And in chapter 2, we see the benefits of Ruth to Naomi. Ruth has in so many ways taken care of Naomi, and the way she was able to take care of Naomi was through the kindness of a man they had forgotten about in Bethlehem named Boaz. Boaz had let her glean in the fields and given her a bit of a sweetheart deal on it. He didn't just let her pick up the leftovers. He left leftovers behind in the field. And Ruth and Naomi were then able to live, at least for the kinds of people who would glean in the fields, a fairly comfortable life. They got to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, but now as we get to Ruth chapter 3, the barley harvest is beginning to end, and Naomi has questions. Because Boaz's kindness has been really wonderful to them to get them through the season, but Naomi at this point is looking for something a little bit more permanent. Boaz's kindness has been wonderful, but kindness alone will not secure Ruth and Naomi's future. Naomi says this right here in Ruth 3. She looks at Ruth and says, I want rest for you. She's saying that she wants a home for her, stability for her, to get out of this life of gleaning in the field of somebody she's not connected to. What Naomi is eager for is the kind of belonging she experienced back when she was married to somebody like Elimelech and she had land and titles and hopes and futures. She's wanting once again to have what God had blessed her with, and she says, what Boaz is showing us is wonderful, but it's not what we want. It's not what we need. We want real belonging. So Naomi hatches a plan. It's a bit of a weird plan. And we're going to get into that weird plan. But Naomi sees a shot. Naomi sees an opportunity. Because Boaz is a redeemer, which means that he's a family member. It means that if somebody could lay claim to the wife of one of her sons, and if they could perpetuate that line, that there is indeed someone who could do that, and it's Boaz. Now, Boaz, we learned, is quite a great deal older than Ruth last week. He's in a different station of life. There's a lot of different things going on here, but Naomi says it's the end of barley season, and so if there's ever going to be a time to shoot our shot at Mr. Boaz as a redeemer, it's right now. And Naomi, by this point, is so funny because she had called herself bitter a few chapters ago, but now she's like overflowing with hope. She sees some things to be meddled in, and she's going to meddling because now she thinks life might be on the upswing. And so she tells Ruth, this young girl, she says, clean yourself up. Like, get out of the fields, take a bath, anoint yourself. It means, put on perfume. Take your widow's clothes off and dress real nice. I mean, she's trying to make Ruth look attractive. She's trying to doll her up. She's trying to make her as, presentable as she could conceivably be. And she's going to say, go to Boaz's house, or the threshing floor of Boaz, and when he falls asleep, you lay there and uncover the blanket that he's with, and you wake him up, and he'll tell you what to do next. And it's a pretty interesting story. I mean, you're kind of wondering what it is Miss Naomi thinks she's doing. And I don't think it's what you think. But I think the author wants you to think that that's what she's thinking before we get there. So, what does Ruth say to this plan? Because likely if you got told this plan, I think at least some of you would probably be like, no thank you. I would prefer to go about this some other way if at all possible. But Ruth says, Naomi, if this is what you're telling me to do, then I'm going to do it. And I think even right here we learn, at least in the beginning, some pictures of godly faith. Ruth and Naomi have been both in some sense victims of the providence of God in that they recognize God's hand in their suffering rightly, that God has dealt them what was a seemingly difficult blow, but they also are starting to realize that they've been great recipients of God's providence, that God has been so gracious to them and gracious in giving them the kindness of Boaz and a home in Bethlehem and wheat to eat and all of these things. And so now they're starting to think that God seems to be moving in this story in such a way that He's a God that I can trust with my life. And here's what people who trust God do. Something. People who trust in God take action. We so often mistake faith for being this sort of weird spiritualized passivity. We'll use language like we're waiting on God, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that language, but a lot of times we use it as a kind of excuse to just sit there and see what happens, to just kind of take our hands off the wheel and just sit there and wait for a sign from heaven. But I think if there's a lesson for us to learn from this here in Ruth 3, is that real faith is actually that kind of faith that helps us to dream. It helps us to think up good ways to pursue godly ventures with virtue and integrity and hope. It's actually faithlessness that makes people think they just have to sit there and wait for life to happen to them. Faith actually recognizes that God's up to all sorts of good things. So I'm going to go out there and work. Is that not exactly what James tells us, that faith works? I think we should also always be careful of any kind of supposed faith that makes us less likely to take action on things. Be careful that you're not just procrastinating following God with spiritual language. I think often I'm praying about it just becomes a kind of baptized code for I lack the faith to act on what I know I should do. The best time to do the righteous thing is right now. You don't have to pray about doing what God would have you do. You just do it. That's what faith is. And what Ruth is doing, she doesn't know how this situation is going to end up. At no point does she know if Boaz is going to more or less accept her proposal. But here's what we know about Ruth. She trusts the God that she follows. We know that Ruth believes that God is in this for her good. She's believed that since Ruth chapter 1. And so if there's a way to seek God's good in her life, she's willing to trust her hands into the character of the God she follows. And so she can risk and she can take steps of action and she can move forward knowing that God is not going to lead her astray. So Ruth takes her first steps towards the Redeemer in a great step of faith. Now, that great step of faith is going to lead us to a second truth about faith, which is that intentional faith is also vulnerable faith. We'll see this in verses 6 to 9. So remembering all we just said, it says, so she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry, and he went to lie down at the end of a heap of grain. Then she came in softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." It's a funny story, but I don't want us to underestimate just the unique situation that Ruth is putting herself in here. I mean, just to set the scene, it's nighttime. And nighttime, things happen more at night than in the day, right? Boaz has just had a good dinner. It tells us that Boaz has had himself a little wine to drink, so much that his heart's a little bit merry. And that Boaz has had a long day's work, and he's laying down at the end of that hard day, and the narrator knows exactly how this sounds. He's building this tension, but I don't think he's building it to tell us that Ruth is somehow seducing Boaz. Ruth is trusting something about Boaz that I think is actually going to teach us a lot about our trust in the Lord. Because Ruth is putting herself in as vulnerable a position as Ruth could conceivably be put in. If Boaz acts poorly towards Ruth in this moment, everything is ruined for Ruth's future. If Boaz misunderstands the situation, if Boaz treats her dishonorably, if Boaz takes advantage of her, then all of her claims that she's riding on are done. That's the end of kindness for her and Naomi. If Boaz misunderstands what she's doing so as to be upset with her for doing this, then that means the end of kindness for her and Naomi. Ruth is shooting her shot with Boaz in such a way as to leave no other options on the table. Whatever is going to happen is going to be settled on the night of Ruth 3. Her entire future rests on one thing, And the one thing her future rests on in the midst of her vulnerability is the character of the Redeemer to which she is trusting herself. And faith in this way is still intimate when we approach Jesus. Faith is intimate in a weighty and a personal and a vulnerable way. Faith for the believer and faith for Ruth in this moment is not just some cold, dead, mental agreement with a certain set of beliefs. You don't have faith just because you say you believe in God. You don't have faith just because you agree with some particular doctrinal statements. You don't have faith merely just because you say, I prefer this worldview over any other worldview. Faith is actually a whole lot more personal than that. Because if faith was just believing certain things about stuff, then the demons would have faith. No, James tells us that the demons have perfectly orthodox theology, but they don't believe. What is it about Ruth's faith that makes it effective? What is it about our faith that makes it effective? Faith is really Christian faith when you lay yourself bare completely at the feet of the Redeemer. You cannot keep Jesus at arm's distance and have faith. Real Christian faith exposes you totally and personally appeals to the character of the Redeemer for you. I find it interesting even in Boaz and Ruth's little conversation here. Boaz wakes up, he's had a little bit to drink, and he knows who Ruth is, but it's the middle of the night, he's disoriented. He definitely wasn't expecting to wake up with this young woman at his feet, and he asks a question you might ask: who are you? And Ruth does not begin explaining the situation. Ruth does not even begin to try and give a rationale for why she's there. The first thing she says is, I am Ruth. And immediately moves in to telling him exactly what she would like. She says, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And this language is really important because if you remember last week in Ruth 2, Boaz had appealed or bragged on Ruth for a specific thing. The reason he showed kindness to Ruth was what? Because he said at the core of it that she had fled her native people and that she had come under the wings of God, right? She had sought refuge under God's protection. This was in Ruth chapter 2, verse 12. She had sought protection under the God of Israel's wings, and that's why he was showing kindness to her. And Ruth is in essence right here calling his bluff, if she thinks it is that. She says, if you want to reward me for coming under the wings of the God of Israel, then why don't you act like I am one who has come under the wings of the God of Israel? I don't just want to be near you. I don't just want to be treated kindly by you. I want you to redeem me. That's what she's saying. And she's saying, here I am. If there's anything about me that you don't want, now is the time for you to tell me. If you don't want to do this Redeemer thing, you can call it off. But it's the end of harvest, and I'm in need, and I need a Redeemer, and you're a Redeemer, so act like a Redeemer, Boaz. She is laying it all on the line. And I think in no uncertain way, this is the exact way we should approach Jesus. Not merely as people just saying, I believe some things about you, and I would like you to accept me. We need him, brothers and sisters. You're not like a good person looking for a decent worldview. You are a sinner in need of grace. You have nothing to offer, and nor did Ruth. Ruth coming into Boaz's family provides Boaz nothing. Boaz's life is only made more complicated by being a Ruth. There is no benefit to Boaz here. Ruth just needs Boaz to save her. And brothers and sisters, I would encourage you that there is no salvation in invulnerable faith. And I think so much of what passes for faith in the South is this kind of respectable faith that is, I can come to church and I can confess sin generally and I can be a decent looking person and I can show up every second Sunday, and I can give a little in the offering, and someday I'll get to heaven and I'll tell God, I had faith, didn't I? Look at my faith, God. And God will say, I never had a clue who you were. You never needed me. You always just thought I was a healthy little addition to, being this and that. I think some of us would rather be respected than be redeemed. And the fact is that Ruth realizes there is no redemption where she keeps her self-respect intact. She's going to make Boaz make a decision. Boaz is either going to have to accept her or she's going to be thrown out in the dark, and those are her only two options. She's not playing any kind of halfway game. And I would encourage you, there is no good halfway game to play with Jesus. You need all of him or you get none of him. But there is no way to play this game halfway. But the question that raises for me is, that's pretty bold for Ruth to go in and do this. I mean, we're not used to asking for things this boldly. On what basis exactly can Ruth do this? Like, is she just hoping against hope, or does she have some reason for thinking that this is an appropriate thing to ask? And I really think that she has good reason to ask this, because God had made certain promises, and God had laid out certain things in the law, and God had prepared the way in such a way that it was good and right for Ruth to ask for this. She can ask this because faith is not merely vulnerable, but faith is based in covenants that God himself has made. So our third aspect of faith is that faith is covenantal. And this is, I think, the most important part. If there is a center of Ruth 3, I want you to look back at verse 9, and we'll read through 13. In verse 9 he says, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. And for all my fellow townsmen know you are a worthy woman. And now, it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." I want to make something clear about what's happening in Ruth 3. Ruth 3 is not Ruth and Boaz having a romantic moment together. Ruth 3 is not a love story in the traditional way that we might think of a love story. Ruth is making a covenant claim. She is saying that Boaz is obligated to do something. She's telling Boaz that he has promised, or he is in a position to do what she needs, and she seems to be insinuating that if he be a righteous man, that he will indeed do it. There's all sorts of weird preaching that goes on about Ruth 3 that kind of even preaches Ruth 3 like a manual for dating or finding a spouse or how to recognize godly characteristics in a man or woman. And that's not at all what's going on here. This is a summons for Boaz to fulfill his obligation as a redeemer. Christopher Ashe, a commentator on Ruth, said this. He said, "Ruth 3 has nothing to teach young people about dating. The Bible does not commend young women to follow Ruth's example unless they are A, first transported back into ancient Israel, B, are destitute, C, have a destitute Israelite mother-in-law, and D, live in a society where a relative of your mother-in-law might be expected to marry you and raise up a son to carry on your mother-in-law's family line in the Promised Land. In the absence of these factors, young Christian women ought to learn purity and wisdom in relationships with young men from plenty of other scriptures." So this is not a love story in that sense. That's not what's happening. But it is a love story, I think, in a much bigger, more cosmic, includes me and you kind of sense. This is a story of covenant love. This is a story of the kind of love that God has for his people. This is the kind of love that we base our hopes and dreams on when we come in faith vulnerably to Jesus. And here's what I mean when I say that. Christian faith is coming to Jesus, laying hold of the promises that we know he has obligated himself to keep. Faith does not come to Jesus saying some version of, "I really hope Jesus is feeling merciful today. I hope he's in a good mood. I hope he will accept me. I hope things go well. I hope he's not too disappointed with how I've acted." Faith comes to Jesus saying some equivalent of this. You promised. Because Jesus did. You think about the promises that Jesus himself obligated himself to. Whoever comes to me, I will not cast out. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us. You think about language. He's faithful and He's just. That's legal language. That's righteousness language. That's obligation language. We come to Jesus and say, save me, because you promised that you were that kind of Savior. Faith, for me and you, brothers and sisters, is not the strength of the belief we can muster up to make God pleased with us, as though if we come really hoping the right kind of way that He might take us. Our hope is in the reliability of the Redeemer in which we place our faith. Our hope is in the object of our faith, which is exactly what Ruth's hope was. She was hoping that this Redeemer was the kind of man that He had said He was. And brothers and sisters, when we approach Jesus, we approach Him hoping indeed that He is the kind of man that He has said He is. And the good news of the gospel is that He has fully and finally proven that He is that kind of man. And Ruth finds out in this text that her faith is not misplaced. Ruth cries out to this Redeemer, and she discovers that He's exactly who she hoped He was. And I think another fourth aspect of faith we learn here at the end of Ruth is that when we come to Jesus with this kind of vulnerable, intentional, covenant faith, we receive assurance from that faith. Boaz reveals some really beautiful things here about the heart of a Redeemer. Again, to backtrack, Ruth has put everything on the table, right? Her dignity, her future, her safety, her reputation. Boaz, though, in this moment, doesn't respond with anything that might put that at risk. Boaz doesn't respond with anger. Boaz doesn't respond with rejection. Boaz doesn't respond by exploiting her, which likely would have been the response of many men in that day and age. He responds by blessing her. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. And then he says what I think are my favorite words in the entire passage that I'm sure were very comforting to Ruth. Fear not. What happens in this passage is that Ruth's faith did not create some willingness in the Redeemer to save her. Ruth's faith simply discovered the Redeemer's willingness to save her. Ruth, in coming to Boaz, discovered that he is exactly who she thought he was. And Boaz gives her assurance, not on the basis that she's done a really good thing, but he says, I will see to it that this happens the way it's supposed to happen. And I think for so many of us, we get assurance backwards in the Christian life. Most of us, and I think poorly, try to find assurance that our faith is real by looking inwardly and performing this kind of spiritual autopsy on ourselves to see, like, have I been good? Have I done enough? Have I given enough? Have I said enough? Have I been righteous enough? And you look inwardly and you see stuff that you're not really happy with, and then you wonder, like, do I really believe? Am I really a Christian? Is this really true? And I would say that's getting assurance exactly wrong. We can learn a lot from Ruth here. Ruth leaves assured, not because of any particular action that Ruth took in this text. Ruth leaves assured because her Redeemer assured her that He would be the one doing the job. One of the most helpful things you can ever do for your assurance of salvation is to look less at you and look more at Jesus. Because it's in Him and His work that we find our true and our clear assurance. Why do you know that you're saved? Well, because if you put your faith in Jesus, He said that He's the kind of Redeemer who saves. It's not the strength of your faith that keeps you in. As John MacArthur once said, if you could lose your salvation, you would. You'd figure it out. We have such weak faith at times. We have such poorly motivated faith, broken faith. But we have a perfect Redeemer. And He's assured us with greater assurances than even Boaz could give that He, indeed, gives us no cause to fear. When you approach Him and you ask for forgiveness, the great news of the gospel is that you have it full and free. And so you hear these words and you think, well then Ruth and Naomi's story is secure. Everything's going to be over. Like this is a win. Everything's perfect. But we learned the very last thing in Ruth about faith, which is that faith is also patient, because a promise from a Redeemer does not mean immediate resolution from that Redeemer. Here at the end of the passage, you're hoping to hear wedding bells, but it seems like in Ruth 4 we're setting up for one final conflict, because Boaz has already noted a problem. There's another Redeemer out there. There's one closer than me. We don't know who this guy is, and the text is never going to tell us his name, but apparently there's another relative who has a closer claim on Naomi and Ruth than Boaz does. And the whole reason that Boaz has not already offered to redeem her is not because he didn't want to, but simply because he's so righteous he's been waiting on the person with the right legal claim to take his claim. But now that Ruth has pressed him, he's saying, I'm going to go out and I'm going to talk to this guy and see if he will go ahead and lay claim. If so, that's great for you and Naomi. But if not, I promise you, I will see to this being done. But what's going to happen is Ruth is now going to, after all this vulnerability and intentionality, she's going to have to sit there and wait to see what's going to actually happen. You can see this in really verses 14 through 18 at the end of the chapter. So she lay at his feet until morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known to the women, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it. And he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. So Ruth returns home, and she has in her hands this promise, this kind of pre-engagement. But the work of redemption has not yet been completed for Ruth and Naomi. Boaz is a willing redeemer. He has blessed her. He has been kind to her. He has protected her. He has provided for her. He's assured her. But there is still this redeemer, and so Ruth walks home. I'm still positive, not sure how all this is going to turn out. Chapter 3 ends with no resolution, only Ruth waiting to see how things might go. But I love Naomi's picture of faith right here at the end of the chapter, because bitter old Naomi has turned into the model of Christian maturity by the end of chapter 3. She has had the joy given back into her heart, because this thing that she says at the end is so full and rich of gospel truth that you almost just can't overlook it when she says, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest but he will settle the matter today. Why is it that when Ruth gets home, that Naomi can be so positive about their really bizarre and bold plan not completely working out? Why is it she can be so positive? Well, because she trusts that while Ruth waits, the Redeemer is going to be at work. She trusts that the Redeemer will not rest, that the Redeemer himself will see to it that things get done. And waiting is hard for all of us, because waiting always... If we panic in the face of things not going the way we thought they might, what we show is that maybe control was actually our God. Right? If when things don't immediately go to plan and all of a sudden every bit of faith you have in your body leaves the premises, maybe it wasn't God you were trusting, but your own ability to control the situation. If every time something does go to plan, we turn bitter and cold, maybe comfort was our God, not the God of the Bible. If we quit obeying as soon as things don't go according to plan, maybe outcomes were our God, not the God of the Bible. But what Naomi and Ruth teach us, they're not so worried about the outcomes. By this point, they're not so worried about how they might control the situation. By this point, they trust the promises of God. She knows that the Redeemer's working. Much like Ruth put her hands in the character of the Redeemer, Naomi's encouraging her to still trust in the character of the Redeemer. And she knows that she can be patient because the Redeemer is not resting. And I think the best news in the world for me and you who right now live much in the same space between the promise and the fulfillment of the promise, where we often have to wait and don't know the full end of the story. Our hope is not in that things might go exactly the way we would have them to go, but knowing that our Redeemer is indeed working all things together for our good. Did you know right now Christ is working? Did you know that when you go to sleep tonight, which sleep is one of those great vulnerabilities, right? One of those great reminders that the world doesn't need you, that it keeps spinning whether you're doing anything or not. Psalm 127 tells us that God doesn't sleep. While you're sleeping, He's working. While you're waiting, He's working. While you're doing things you shouldn't do, He's working. Do you know that there's not been one moment in your Christian life where the Redeemer has not been interceding on your behalf already? You have not yet found the moment in time when God has not been working far better works on your behalf than you have ever worked for you. God is working. And so why is it you can have a patient faith today, even when things don't look like you want? Well, because you know your Redeemer's working. You don't have to know how things will turn out, right? And you think about all the situations that cause us to spaz out in life. I mean, financial difficulty. I mean, what really is financial difficulty in the fact that you know the Redeemer of heaven and earth who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills is working things for your good, right? Think about marriage difficulties. Well, you've never had a more unfaithful spouse than you are to the Lord, no? Yet He's still working. You think about relationship difficulties. You think about sickness and cancer and pain and difficulty with parents, and you think about tragedies in the lives of your children or whatever else it might be, and you look and you say, I don't have a clue how any and all of this turns out. I don't like this. This isn't what I thought things would be like. I thought I'd be further along. I thought that they would be further along. I thought things would be different. But what does the mature Christian say? Do they grow bitter and cold about these realities? Do they get cynical and disobedient because of these realities? Do they just go sit in the corner, cross their arms, and pout? No, what mature faith says is, I don't know what God's doing, but I know He's doing something, so I can open my hands in obedience and live faithfully no matter what He brings, because I know that my Redeemer is alive, and I know that my Redeemer is moving, and I may not see it, and I may not know it, but He's bringing all things into the place that they should be. And by the end of Ruth 3, you see this beautiful picture in Ruth and Naomi and Boaz of this vibrant faith, of this wonderful faith that lives in such beautiful ways that while we might not even be able to define it, you see their lives and you think, that's what faith is. And so if I have one application for you tonight, and I just want one, is could somebody learn what faith is by watching your life? Because while Ruth 3 may not define faith, it does show us faith. Ruth's story, like so many other stories in the Old Testament, become a picture of a faith that moves and risks and exposes need and appeals to covenant promises and receives assurance and waits faithfully. It's like the Spirit is pointing out in the book of Ruth, like, there it is. That's what faith is. And I wonder if He could point to your life and say the same. Could someone, not even just here, but out in the world out there, see intentional faith when you obey when the outcome of obedience is uncertain? Do people look at you and say you're a person of risky faith? I don't know if anybody's ever told you this, but faith is not difficult when everything is easy. There is no great witness in faith when things are all going your way. But do people out there see you a person of great faith when it almost seems silly for you to have it? Do they see real faith in the way that you stop hiding behind the ridiculous masks we all wear and bring your actual self to Jesus? Do they see you repent not just of generic sins, but of real ones? Do they see you be honest about your position in life and real about your need for a Redeemer? Or do they see you trying to put on airs to act like the kind of person who doesn't need that kind of stuff? Do they see the faith that trusts in the covenant promises of God with the absolutely assured and confident way that you grab hold of everything that God knows is true? Do they see in you somebody who is not shaken by the problems of the world, who is not blown off course by news they see on Facebook or on the political whims of the day? Do they see somebody for whom when sickness strikes or when preferences are not met or when things just don't work out the way you were hoping, do they see somebody who's happy because their happiness isn't based in their circumstances but on the promises of God? Do they see the way your faith works when you suffer well and when you wait and trust that the Redeemer is at work in all things? I think that Ruth 3 teaches us that lives of faith are worth living even when they're really hard. And so many of us think that what faith must mean is comfort and control, and if I have the right amount of faith, things will go the right way. Ruth and Naomi, by this point, are just like, we have no idea where this story is going. This whole thing's been bizarre and crazy. We're hatching harebrained plans. We're losing husbands and wives. This whole story's been a mess. But by the end of it, they're happy because they have a Redeemer, and that's all they need. So could somebody define faith by looking at your life? Funny enough, the only way to have that kind of faith is not by trying to live a life that has that kind of faith. It's actually by taking your eyes off yourself and looking at your Redeemer, much like Ruth does. Because what we see in Jesus is a much greater picture than what we see in Boaz. Boaz is going to cover Ruth with his garment, just like Ruth asked him. But if you remember from Sunday, Jesus is going to cover us with a much greater righteousness. Boaz is going to go to the gate, and he is going to settle a legal claim that indeed gives him rights to Miss Ruth and Naomi. Jesus went to the cross settling a much greater legal claim than that which Boaz had to settle. Jesus went and settled the claim of divine justice on your sin. Boaz would not wait until Ruth's redemption was finished, but Jesus goes to the cross and fully and finally says, "It is finished," when he makes redemption's work sure. So the great news for you today is, barring you knowing anything about the end of the story, you can come to him and know that he will not cast you out because you have a Redeemer who is worthy and willing and able. And the gospel says you have no other thing that you need than to say, "Spread your wings over me," because you are a Redeemer. And when you do that, in that, you will find the kind of faith you need to face anything life could throw at you. Because we know indeed that our Redeemer is working all things, even right now, for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Let's pray. God, we thank you for all of your blessings. We thank you for any opportunity to come before you and study your word. I pray that even as we have spent this time reflecting on Ruth chapter 3, that you would once again keep our eyes on you, even as we sing this great song here in a moment about your mercy. God, would you help us to lift our eyes off of ourselves and lift them onto you, the one who's redeemed us from sin and death, knowing full well that you're at work in the lives of all those who have come to you by faith. And we ask this in Jesus' name.